I'd always preferred the quiet parts of the backcountry, the places that didn't show up on postcards or social media feeds, places where the road thinned into gravel, cell service faded away, and the forest felt old enough to remember things you didn't. Walnut Flats was one of those places. Tucked into the Virginia mountains, it was known mostly by locals and people who didn't mind driving a little farther for peace. There was a narrow trailhead, a slow-moving stream filled with trout, and a small grocery store about 15 minutes down the road that sold bait, ice, and just enough food to get by. That Tuesday started the same way so many good trips do. I headed out alone early in the morning, the sky pale and clear, the air cool enough to keep the bugs away. I parked where I always did, hauled my gear in by hand, and set up my tent before the sun climbed too high. The forest smelled like wet leaves and pine, and the only sounds were birds and water moving over stone. It felt right. Fishing went better than expected. By late morning, I had already caught my limit. The trout were biting easily, flashing silver in the water before disappearing into my cooler. I stayed longer than I needed to, partly because it felt good to be there, and partly because I was waiting on my old friend to arrive. We'd planned this trip weeks ago. He was driving in from another town and was supposed to meet me around mid-afternoon. I packed up the rod and drove to the grocery store to see if he'd already shown. He wasn't there. I grabbed a soda, chatted briefly with the cashier, and headed back up the mountain road toward camp. That was when the dog ran out into the road. It came out of the brush suddenly, stopping in front of my truck, like it wasn't sure whether to run or stand its ground. I braked hard, heart jumping, and rolled to a stop. A moment later, a man stepped out of the trees after it. He looked thin, almost stretched, like he hadn't eaten properly in a while. His hair was messy and unwashed, sticking out in uneven clumps. His clothes were old and worn, the kind that had been slept in more times than they'd been washed. He raised a hand in a small wave and asked if the dog belonged to me. I told him no. He relaxed a little and explained that he'd been fishing too, but hadn't caught anything all day. His voice was quiet, polite, not aggressive, not demanding, just tired. I looked at the dog, then at the cooler in the back of my truck, and felt that familiar pull to help. Out there, people look out for each other, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I handed him a few trout. His face changed instantly. Gratitude flashed across it, sharp and hungry. He thanked me more than once, called the dog over, and disappeared back into the trees without another word. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the brush settle back into stillness, then continued on to camp. Even though I already had my limit, I grabbed my rod again and went back to the stream. My friend and I would need supper, and I figured one more fish wouldn't matter. The forest was quiet again, and before long I was focused on the water, the line, the slow rhythm that always calmed me. When I returned to camp later that afternoon, my friend had arrived. He was a big man, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that made you feel safer just standing next to him. He worked as a truck driver and had been doing it for years. We'd known each other since childhood, long enough that silence between us never felt awkward. He pitched his tent while I built a fire and cleaned the fish. The smell of wood smoke drifted through camp, mixing with the sound of crackling flames. As the fish cooked, the man from earlier walked past again, the dog padding quietly at his side. We invited him to join us. He hesitated at first, then stepped closer, warming his hands over the fire. He introduced himself and told us stories about his life. Said he'd gone to college, said he'd worked in engineering for a big company before retiring early, claimed he'd been camping in the area for 2 weeks straight. The details came easily, too easily, like they'd been rehearsed. He ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As we talked, I noticed something odd. He kept turning in place, slowly, warming his hands over the fire, then turning his back to it, then his hands again, over and over, like he couldn't get comfortable, or like he needed to keep moving. The dog stayed close, silent. The conversation stayed light, sports, work, fishing, the kind of talk you use to fill space. But as the light drained from the sky and the forest darkened, something felt wrong. Around 8:30, he stood up suddenly and said it was time for him to head back to his camp. That was when the questions started forming in my mind. He'd said his camp was an hour away through the woods. It was pitch black now, no moon worth mentioning, no trail lights, and he didn't strike me as someone who knew these paths well enough to walk them confidently at night. I asked where exactly his camp was. He pointed vaguely into the trees and said it wasn't far if you knew the path. My friend glanced at me but didn't speak. The man called for the dog, stepped behind my friend, and everything happened at once. 2 loud bangs shattered the quiet. My friend jerked forward, blood spreading across his shirt. The man was holding a gun, small, black, already pointed in my direction. I dove toward the trees, but another shot rang out, and pain tore into my neck like fire. I hit the ground hard, hands scrambling instinctively to the wound. Blood sprayed between my fingers, warm and fast. My mind screamed that this was it, that I wasn't getting up again. My friend made it to his truck. I don't remember standing, but I remember running. I remember pulling open the passenger door and collapsing inside. The man walked right up to the driver's window, raised the gun to my friend's head, and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. My friend hit the gas. We tore down the dirt road, blood everywhere, both of us barely holding on. His face was a mess of swelling and red. My neck throbbed with every heartbeat. I told him not to stop, to keep driving. He nodded, but I could see him fading. The truck began to sway. I reached over, grabbed the wheel, and held us straight while he fought to stay conscious. 5 miles later, we hit a cluster of houses. I turned us into the first driveway I saw and staggered to the door, blood coating my hands. The family inside saved our lives. What came after, the ambulances, the helicopters, the surgery, the recovery, blurred together. The man was identified later. He crashed my truck deliberately and died in custody not long after. People said they'd worried about him for years. I lost my truck. I lost my favorite fly rod. I lost the feeling that the woods were always safe. But we lived. And sometimes that has to be enough. The hike was supposed to be easy. That was the whole point of it. A quiet trail recommended by a couple of locals who described it as scenic and mostly ignored. The kind of place where you could walk side by side without having to step aside for anyone else, where conversation flowed as easily as the path itself. After weeks of work and noise and schedules, that sounded perfect. We packed light, water, snacks, a folded map we barely looked at, and phones we assumed would work if we needed them. We drove out early, parking at a small pull-off where the trail disappeared into the trees. The air smelled damp and green, and the forest felt calm in a way that made you breathe deeper without realizing it. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The trail was narrow but well-worn, trees pressing close on both sides. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in uneven patches. We talked about work, about people we knew, about nothing important at all. It felt good to move, to stretch muscles that spent too much time sitting still. We stopped by a small stream to rest. The water moved slowly over smooth stones, quiet enough that we could talk without raising our voices. We sat on a fallen log and ate apples, laughing about something small and forgettable. That was when I noticed movement behind us on the trail. A man was walking toward us. He was older than I'd expected to see out there alone, with messy hair that hadn't been cut in a long time and a shirt that hung loose on his frame. His shoes were worn down, the soles thin and uneven. He carried a small bag slung over one shoulder and moved with the confidence of someone who knew the trail well. He greeted us when he got closer, his voice rough but friendly enough, commented on the weather, said it was a nice day for a walk. We responded politely, the way you do when there's no obvious reason not to. He told us the trail was his favorite, said he walked it all the time, introduced himself. We gave our names in return. I noticed that while he spoke, his eyes kept drifting away from us, scanning the woods on either side of the path, as if he expected something to appear. We talked for a few minutes. He asked where we were from, and my friend answered honestly, naming our town. He said he lived nearby, in a cabin off the main roads, mentioned how peaceful it was out there, how no one bothered you. That comment stuck with me, though I couldn't have said why at the time. When we stood up to continue walking, I expected him to head on his way. Instead, he fell into step beside us. He asked if he could join us for a bit, said the trail got lonely sometimes. I remember glancing at my friend and shrugging. It didn't seem dangerous. 3 people on a trail felt safer than 2. That's what I told myself. So we kept walking, him positioned neatly between us, as if it had happened naturally. At first, he was almost pleasant. He pointed out birds we would have missed, named trees and plants, talked about the area like someone who had spent years memorizing its details. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the conversation shifted. He asked personal questions, if we had boyfriends, if we lived alone. My friend laughed them off, trying to keep things light, but I could hear the edge creeping into her voice. When she answered that we were just there for exercise, his smile tightened just slightly. He warned us about strange people in the woods, said hikers disappeared sometimes. The trail narrowed as we went, branches brushing our arms, the ground uneven underfoot. We were miles from the car now. I leaned toward my friend and suggested we pick up the pace. She nodded, but when we did, he matched us easily. He asked why we were rushing, said we had plenty of time. Then he started a story about a woman who'd gotten lost out there, said she'd wandered off the trail and disappeared for days, described how terrified she must have been, alone and disoriented, unable to find her way back. My friend tried to change the subject, asking if there was a shortcut back toward the trailhead. He chuckled, said shortcuts were dangerous, said we should stick with him because he knew all the safe ways. That was the moment the unease turned into something
Up there
sharper.
in the canopy, you can see
The
the
forest
birds
felt
moving among
closer,
the trees.
quieter,
The leaves are
the
rustling in
air
the breeze.
heavier. We reached a point where the trail split, one branch climbing toward a rocky hill, the other dipping down into thicker growth. He asked which way we were going. My friend pointed uphill. He shook his head and told us it was a dead end, said we should follow him instead. I grabbed her arm and whispered that we should go up, now. We turned without explaining and hurried up the hill, leaves crunching loudly under our boots. Behind us, his voice followed, raised just enough to carry. He told us to wait, said it was not safe that way. We didn't stop. At the top, I glanced back and saw him standing at the split, watching us. Then he started moving again, faster this time, his steps deliberate. My heart slammed in my chest. We ran. The trail twisted through rocks and trees, offering no clear place to hide. We ducked behind a large boulder, pressing ourselves flat and holding our breath. Footsteps approached, unhurried but steady. His voice drifted through the trees, falsely concerned, asking if we were okay, saying he only wanted to help. I peeked out just enough to see his face. The friendliness was gone, his expression tight, angry, focused. He muttered something under his breath and continued past us, moving down the trail. We waited longer than felt reasonable before moving again, creeping back the way we'd come. That's when I heard rustling off to the side. He wasn't on the trail anymore. He was circling. We ran. Branches tore at our arms. My friend tripped and fell hard, skinning her knees, but we were back on our feet in seconds. His voice came again, closer, insisting he wouldn't hurt us. The trail felt endless. Then finally, we saw a clearing ahead, a small ranger station barely visible through the trees. We sprinted toward it. At the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time. He stood just inside the tree line, watching. He didn't follow into the open. Inside the ranger station, the ranger listened as we stumbled through the story. His expression darkened as we described the man. He said others had complained about someone matching that description. They searched the area, but he was gone. He vanished after that. We drove home in silence. Now we stick to busy trails, because some people don't need weapons to be dangerous. They just need time, isolation, and someone willing to keep walking with them.
I had been walking the Appalachian Trail for a couple of months by then, long enough that the rhythm of it had settled into my body. Wake with the light, pack slowly, walk until the miles felt right, find a place to rest. The trail strips life down to simple needs, and in doing so, it gives you space to think. That was why I was out there in the first place. I had left my job behind, left a routine that felt hollow, and decided to see what would happen if I let the world narrow to dirt paths and tree lines. Most days were quiet. You passed other hikers, nodded, shared water sources, exchanged small talk about weather and mileage. Sometimes you walked alone for hours, your thoughts drifting in and out with the terrain. It felt safe in the way shared hardship often does. Everyone out there was supposed to be there for the same reason. That afternoon, I met another hiker at a water spot. He was refilling his bottles, moving carefully like someone who'd already put in a long day. We talked while the water ran, trading the usual trail questions. Where are you headed? How far today? What brought you out here? He said he was taking time away from family expectations, that his kids thought he was crazy for doing the hike at his age. He laughed easily, and nothing about him felt forced or off. We decided to camp near each other that night, not side by side, but close enough that we'd know someone else was there. Company on the trail can be comforting, especially when the forest grows dark and unfamiliar sounds start to surface. We found a small clearing not far off the path, just large enough for 2 tents and a modest fire. As evening came, we shared some food and sat by the flames. The fire was low and careful, not the kind that throws sparks, just enough to cook and warm hands. He talked about his family, I talked about quitting my job and needing space to figure out what mattered. It was the kind of conversation that feels honest because there's no audience for it. The woods were calm. Crickets chirped, wind moved through the trees softly. It was the sort of night that reminded you why people romanticize hiking in the first place. Then, a man stepped out of the trees. He came from the darker side of the clearing, emerging slowly like he hadn't been in any hurry to announce himself. He carried a guitar slung over his back and had a large knife strapped visibly to his belt. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and his movements slightly exaggerated, as if he wanted to be noticed. He greeted us loudly, his voice breaking the quiet like something dropped, asked if he could join us, introduced himself casually, like this was a perfectly normal thing to do. I felt uneasy immediately, though I couldn't have explained it in a way that sounded reasonable. People meet on the trail all the time, people stop and chat, but something about him felt wrong. Maybe it was the knife worn openly, or the way he stood too close to the fire, or how his eyes lingered on me just a second longer than they should have. My campmate invited him to sit, trying to be polite. I stayed quiet, watching. The man sat and started playing his guitar, The songs were old and off-key, the sound echoing strangely through the trees. At first, it was just awkward. Then he started talking between songs, his words drifting into darker territory. He muttered about how no one could hear you out there, about how the trail took what it wanted. He stared into the fire while he spoke, then looked up suddenly, locking eyes with me. He asked if I was alone on the trail, if I was brave or stupid. He laughed too long at his own words. I answered carefully, keeping my voice even, said I'd been fine so far. My campmate tried to redirect the conversation, asking where he was from, but the man brushed it off, saying everywhere and nowhere. As the fire burned lower, the man didn't make any move to leave. Eventually, my campmate stood and suggested calling it a night. Early start tomorrow, he said. The man nodded, but didn't stand. He watched as we headed to our tents, his eyes following us in a way that made my skin crawl. I zipped my tent shut and lay there listening. The forest returned to its usual sounds, but every snap of a twig felt amplified. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the man, replaying his words, the way he'd looked at me. Time stretched. Then I heard voices. At first, they were low, almost indistinct. Then my campmate's voice sharpened, demanding to know what the man was doing. The reply came fast and cold. "The trail is mine now." I pushed myself up and peered through the tent flap. In the moonlight, I saw the man standing over my campmate's tent. The knife was out, catching the light in quick flashes. My campmate was trying to get up, tangled in fabric, and then the man lunged. The sound that followed was horrible, fabric tearing, a wet, choking noise. My campmate cried out once before the sound cut off abruptly. My brain struggled to accept what I was seeing. I grabbed my headlamp and the small knife from my pack. My hands shook so badly I thought I might drop it. The man was slashing at the tent, grunting with effort, blood darkening the ground. I knew I couldn't help him. Staying meant dying. I slipped out the back of my tent and moved into the trees, trying to be quiet, but a branch snapped under my foot. The man's head snapped up. He called out, his voice sharp now, asking where he thought he was going. I ran. The forest closed in around me, branches whipping my face, roots catching my boots. His footsteps crashed through the undergrowth behind me, heavy and relentless. He shouted that I couldn't hide, that he could see me. I ducked into a thick patch of brush and turned off my light, crouching low. Thorns tore into my arms, but I didn't move. I held the knife tight, breath shallow, praying he wouldn't see me. He stopped nearby, breathing hard. I could hear him moving, slashing at bushes, muttering to himself. Minutes passed like hours. My legs burned from holding still. Finally, his footsteps moved away, back toward the camp. I waited until the forest felt empty again, then crept out and found the trail. I didn't stop running. Hours later, as dawn broke, I stumbled into a group of hikers. I was scratched, filthy, shaking. They listened as I tried to explain. One of them used a satellite phone to call for help. Authorities came. They took me to safety. They found my campmate's body later. He'd been stabbed repeatedly. The man was caught days afterwards, still on the trail, threatening others. I never finished that hike. Some trails don't give you peace. They just show you how thin the line really is.